And now it's my pleasure to introduce Hazel Rowley. Hazel Rowley is an acclaimed biographer and essayist. Her books include a biography of Christina Stead, which was named a notable book by the New York Times, a critically acclaimed biography of Richard Wright, which was written while she was affiliated here at Harvard with the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, and Tête-à-Tête, a best-selling exploration of the relationship between Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. Her articles and reviews have appeared in numerous publications, including Partisan Review, Mississippi Quarterly, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and The Nation, among many others. And her essays have been chosen 4 times for the Best Australian Essays Anthology. Her new biography, Franklin and Eleanor, delves into one of the most important, controversial, and misunderstood political marriages in American history. A recent review in Library Journal notes, without resort to sensationalism, the author turns a familiar story into a page-turner, bringing out the nuances of this marriage and their relationships with others around them without demeaning either. And James Strodes of the Washington Times writes, I will go so far as to say that if you are going to read only one book about this extraordinary couple, this is the one. And now please join me in welcoming Hazel Rowley.
I was indeed here at the turn of the century, the late 90s and 2000, and the book was Richard Wright was published in 2001, and I came here to speak about it. So it is a particular delight to be back at the Harvard bookstore. Harvard Square has changed a lot, and this has hardly changed, and I'm a great conservative, not politically, but I love Harvard Square and what it used to be. Franklin Roosevelt was here at Harvard at the turn of the century. The 1900s. He started at Harvard in September 1900, studying history, economics, and government. And he was very proud to be editor of the Harvard Crimson. I think it's almost a premonition that he said the nice thing about the Harvard Crimson was that it was a chance to bring together the Harvard community. It was one of his things, community, which I'm going to talk about tonight. He knew Eleanor, of course. Eleanor was his 5th cousin once removed, and during their childhood they'd met several times. But my book starts in the summer of 1902, when they accidentally meet on the Central train going up the Hudson, and he sees her. He hadn't seen her for several years, and she had just been in England for 3 years and had been transformed from the sort of sad little orphan of the family. Both her parents died before she was 10, to being a rather beautiful, elegant, willowy 5'11", but he was 6'1". And she had learnt to dress well, and she had changed, and her beautiful blue eyes had got a sparkle in them which they'd never had before. And Franklin was interested, decidedly. And he started courting her really that Christmas. And in 2003, November 1903, he invited her up here for the Harvard-Yale game, the big game. He was actually cheerleader for Harvard, and they lost 16-0 to Yale. But the next day, they went up together to Groton, where Franklin had gone to school and where Eleanor's younger brother was, and he proposed by the river. He was sensible enough, I think, to know that his mother wasn't going to be happy, and he dreaded telling her, in fact. Franklin had certainly been with more beautiful women and more worldly women, and Eleanor was a bit of a sad case in the family. There's no doubt that Sarah Roosevelt, his mother, was not keen. And when he broke the news to her, she was shocked. So this was one of the few times that Franklin, I think that he chose Eleanor with the kind of sixth sense that he would often display later when he was choosing people to work with, his team. Eleanor was caring. She was interested in the world. She cared about other people. She was selfless. She was quite thin at the time, but remarkably full of energy. He knew what he wanted, His mother wasn't at all pleased, and he wrote to her one of the interesting letters when he actually stood up to his mother. He wrote to her on Harvard crimson notepaper, telling her, this was shortly after he'd told her that he'd proposed. She said she wanted them to hide the engagement for a year. She wasn't at all pleased. He was far too young, and so on. And then he wrote to her on Harvard crimson notepaper telling her that he was working into the early hours of the morning on the newspaper and on various committees, and then came this: "Dearest Mamma, I know what pain I must have caused you, and you know I wouldn't do it if I really could have helped it. Mais tu sais, me voilà." That's all that could be said. I knew my mind, I've known it for a long time, and know that I could never think otherwise. Result, I'm the happiest man just now in the world, likewise the luckiest. And for you, dear Mummy, you know that nothing can ever change what we have always been and always will be to each other. Only now you have 2 children to love and to love you. And Eleanor, as you know, will always be a daughter to you in every true way. Quite a moving letter. I thought I knew quite a bit about the Roosevelts. I think we all think we know quite a bit about the Roosevelts. And when I first moved to New York, I went fairly quickly up to the FDR Museum, and I was struck that people on the guided tour were full of questions that they didn't know the answer to, and the questions were they had a negative view of the marriage, and the questions were, it was just a facade, wasn't it? And Eleanor was really a lesbian, wasn't she? And Franklin did love another woman, didn't he? And so on. And I must say what struck me on that tour was both the beauty of the place, the nature and so on, and the simplicity of the houses they had both built, a little bit away from each other later on in their marriage. I was struck too by the question, how was it possible for a man who came down with infantile paralysis, as it was called, at the age of 39 and couldn't walk a step on his own? He became a paraplegic. This virile, athletic, good-looking man became a paraplegic at 39. How was it possible for him to become president of the United States at the age of 50? We thought it wasn't possible for a black man to become president of the United States. This was a similar sort of thing. Then how was it possible for Eleanor Roosevelt, such a shy, insecure, not terribly beautiful young woman from America's most major Republican family? Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican president, was president at the time. How was it possible for her to become the most outspoken, controversial, progressive, democratic first lady this country has ever known? And it struck me that it must have a great deal to do with the marriage. So that by the time I drove back to Manhattan at the end of that day, my next book was seated in my mind, partly because they were all asking questions about the relationship, and somebody asked, what's the best book on the topic? And the guide said, well, actually, there is nothing recent. Joseph Lash wrote a book called Eleanor and Franklin 40 years ago. And then we all know that there's the Doris Kearns Goodwin book. But that focuses on the final 5 years in the marriage. So mine is from the courtship to the day Franklin died in 1945 after 12 years in the White House, the beginning of his 4th term. And I take it a little bit beyond that, Eleanor's life beyond that. I was completely open to what I would find. I was fascinated by this marriage, but I was prepared to find that it wasn't very good, or I was prepared to find that it was much better than people thought. I mean, my idea was to just read everything, to immerse myself, and to read a lot between the lines, because I was up against the fact that, these were people who knew that their letters would be perused and so on. Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography was written when she was in the White House. I knew I had to read intelligently between the lines. But, I found out very quickly that it's a marriage that's shrouded in mystery still, and which is astounding when you think about it. We're talking about the most famous presidential couple ever. I mean, from the day of their wedding in March 1905, when the bride was given away by President Theodore Roosevelt, to Franklin's death in 1945 at the beginning of his fourth term, he and Eleanor lived in the public gaze under relentless scrutiny. And somehow they managed to lead quite unconventional private lives, very unpuritanical, and keeping major details from the public. What struck me too was that the biographies of Franklin and the biographies of Eleanor, often 4 volumes long, are all actually polarized. The Franklin biographies can be misogynist to an amazing degree, painting Eleanor as earnest, boring, poor old Franklin. And the Eleanor biographies portray Franklin as a sort of slippery egotist who rather used her, and she gave up her life for him. I wanted very much to write a book. Well, this is what happened out of my research. I wanted to write a book about both of them, balanced equally about both of them. And I also have increasingly, having written rather thick books, I increasingly belong to the sort of Lytton-Strachey school of biography, which is short. I want you to be able to read this in bed and hold the book in your hands and not have to then go on to volume 2, volume 3. I believe you can portray the arc of a life by hinting at things, using details that, a book can have hidden depths, as it were. You don't have to spell out. You can rely on the intelligence of your readers. So just in the short 20 minutes remaining to you, I do want to give you some idea of why I completely disagree with nearly all the literature out there on the Roosevelts. It has gone down in history. By the way, I don't know whether you've read the new edition of The New Yorker, a Thanksgiving issue. I was reading it on the plane this morning. There's an article on Eleanor Roosevelt and the White House cooking when she was First Lady. But it's a typical, she obviously hasn't read my book yet, and it was the typical sort of patronizing view of the Roosevelt marriage, calling it a facade, even going to the point of saying that Eleanor was repelled if Franklin tried to hug her, and portraying the sort of cooking in the White House as a point of contention. I do too, but in my view, it was a quite interesting point of contention. But this blows it up as to being symbolic of the whole marriage. It is not, in my view, a tragic compromise patched together by 2 lonely people, which is the view that most people have of the Roosevelt marriage. I find this an absurdly conventional and condescending interpretation of the bold and radical partnership that has made Franklin and Eleanor go down in history as one of the most inspiring couples of all times. So just very quickly now, I want to say, the turning points maybe. It started out, and this is one of the things that's interesting, as a completely conventional marriage between aristocrats. In fact, they were more under the thumb than most Victorian couples of their time because of Sarah Roosevelt. That very first Christmas, she bought them their first gift, which was the house on East 65th Street. She was going to give them a house, but like all of her gifts, it had a catch. This one was that she was going to live in half of it, and there were going to lots of connecting doors. So I would say the first few years of the marriage weren't particularly happy. They were playing their traditional roles. Franklin was a lawyer, which he never much liked, and Eleanor had 4 babies in 5.5 years, which she didn't like. And Mama was constantly bustling through the connecting doors. And then it was 5.5 years into the marriage that they took their first bold step away from tradition. As you know, the American aristocracy is traditionally Republican voting. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican, but a progressive Republican, nothing like some of the monsters we're seeing today. He believed in government regulation of big business, workers' compensation, women's suffrage, and social insurance. He had so that Franklin cast his first vote for his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, without qualms. He said he was more progressive than the Democrats. But after Theodore Roosevelt left the presidency, Franklin, at the age of 28, stood for the state senate in upstate New York, Hudson Valley, traditionally completely Republican farming area. It was the area he grew up. No one thought he had a chance, and he won the seat. This was 1910, before women had the vote. But Eleanor, stood by her husband. It was actually a bit embarrassing, difficult for her. Their own class, the aristocracy, believed that Franklin was a traitor to his class. And the Roosevelt family, it put her in a difficult position. He actually had, on the night that he became president in March 1933, he invited 80 Roosevelt members back for dinner at the White House. All of them were Republicans. Anyway, so he became a state senator. He moved the family to Albany, which Eleanor liked very much because it put quite a long piece of road between her and Mama, as they both called his mother. And during those 3 years in Albany, well, 3 important things happened. Franklin showed himself to be, he got himself on the national map as he stood against corrupt forces of Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine in New York, and got on in the National Democratic news. He was a name. An intense, chain-smoking young journalist called Louis Howe turned up at the house to interview Franklin and went home and told his wife that he had just met the future president of the United States. He became an extremely close friend. He's a very interesting personality in this book. I intensely love the guy. And then Eleanor began to develop an interest in politics. And people, her friends, were saying that in Albany, the marriage looked much happier. They both looked much happier. And then, in March 1913, Franklin, at the age of 31, landed a prestigious job, which, funnily enough, Theodore Roosevelt had before him, which was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Washington. Eleanor went to huge lengths to help him with his job, getting out on ships, braving seasickness, to accompany him on inspection tours, paying hundreds of social calls, hostessing dinners. When she found herself pregnant again, she employed a social secretary, Lucy Mercer. You all know the story. I don't know why everybody knows this story. It's not all that interesting. But anyway, Lucy Mercer, her social secretary. And this was the war. Franklin was in a very prestigious Navy position, building up the U.S. Navy. He was a little heady, there's no doubt. He was so good looking that all the papers used to comment on him with his film star qualities. And when poor old Eleanor took the kids to Campo Bello, that remote island in Canada off the coast of Maine, every summer to get fresh air and so on, he was, of course, alone in Washington and saw quite a bit of Lucy Mercer. He went to the war to look at U.S. naval operations in 1918, in the summer of 1918. He came back with double pneumonia. He was carried off the ship on a stretcher. Eleanor unpacked his suitcase. You all know it, don't you? He came across a bundle of letters. She came across a bundle of love letters from Lucy Mercer. It was a bad moment in the marriage. Everybody likes to say, most people like to say, it was a turning point. In the New Yorker today, it was a turning point from which the marriage never recovered. In the months after the Lucy Mercer affair, Franklin still called his wife Dearest Babs. She called him Dearest Honey. I mean, they got over it. Many men had affairs in Washington while their wives were away. And, frankly, I don't even know. Nobody knows. It is absolutely impossible for us to know unless some letters turn up. Whether it was even consummated, whether it was even an affair, or whether it was a sort of... certainly it was romantic attachment, certainly they were in love, but what happened on the back streets of those roads of Virginia on those hot nights when he took her driving, we don't know. I conjecture in my book. However, certainly the affair changed Eleanor. I think she realized at that point that she couldn't just be a wife. She had to find an identity beyond that. She had also done really hard public service work during the war, and she loved it. She was working for the Red Cross. And of course it was 1918, 1919. It was now no longer the Victorian period. The First World War changed values. This was now the beginning of the, the Roaring Twenties. Eleanor was meeting progressive women. And I think she was increasingly having trouble with Mama, realizing that, her mother-in-law's values belonged to a bygone world that didn't interest her anymore. For the moment, Eleanor was still primarily a wife. In June 1920, Franklin, at the age of 38, was nominated as the Democratic Party candidate for vice president. Francis Perkins, FDR's future Secretary of Labor, described him at the Democratic Convention. Tall, strong, handsome, and popular, he was one of the stars of the show. I recall how he displayed his athletic ability by vaulting over a row of chairs to get to the platform in a hurry. Eleanor joined Franklin on his campaign train across the country. This, for the first time, women did have the vote, and Eleanor made a difference. It was almost certain that the Democrats would lose that year, and they did, but Franklin made a very positive impact on the national stage. He privately hoped to run next time as presidential candidate. In the meantime, he planned to run as governor of New York. And then in the summer of 1921, when Franklin seemed to be nicely on course for the bully pulpit, for the first time in years planning to spend the whole summer on Campo Bello with his family. Louis Howe was there with his family. The two men were modeling toy ships and planning Franklin's run as governor. And then, on Wednesday, August the 10th, Franklin went to bed shivering and aching all over. And this you know. By Friday, most of his body was paralyzed. This was 1921. Campo Bello was a remote island. There was no bridge for an ambulance to come. There were no helicopters. The one telephone on the island at the Welshpool General Store offered no privacy, and it would have caused panic on the island if Eleanor had described Franklin's symptoms on the phone. The nearest doctor had to motor across on a boat from Lubeck across the straits. He taught Eleanor, who had no nursing training, how to insert a catheter with great care so as not to cause an infection, how to administer an enema, because Franklin was completely, at that point he was paralyzed up to even his face. So by the time a specialist from Boston arrived on the island, a specialist in infantile paralysis, Franklin had been lying in bed for 2 weeks, unable to move, unable to turn, with Eleanor lying, in the bed beside the bed, nursing him 24 hours around the clock. It was, as they feared, polio. 16 years into the marriage, Franklin, at the age of 39, had become a paraplegic. And I talk about what effect that had on the marriage. I've read many books on the effect that polio has on marriage. Very few people remain sexually active if one partner comes down with, due to a car accident or anything else, becomes a paraplegic. It just doesn't work like that. I don't know why it is that everybody sort of finds it odd that they began to have separate bedrooms. Franklin now needed an attendant. He had a valet, a strong black man, to help him dress, and who had to lift him around the place, up and down stairs, in and out of cars. And a nurse, luckily a very cheerful nurse. I think the nurse was the first person who Franklin fell a bit in love, or let's say he depended a great deal on his nurse, which is very typical. She was cheerful. Eleanor, I described the tension in the household that winter. It was just terrible back at East 65th Street. Louis Howe moved in to take over Franklin's work. But, Louis Howe was an asthmatic who wheezed and coughed, and his mother couldn't stand him, that dirty little man, she called him. The children resented Louis Howe's authority in the house and their mother's obvious affection for Louis Howe. Franklin was becoming very dependent on this nurse. There were bursts of laughter every time the nurse was in the room. And there was a titanic power struggle between Mama and Eleanor. Mama wanted him, like his father had been, at home in a wheelchair in Hyde Park so she could look after him, so he could be the gentleman invalid. And Eleanor realized that this would destroy his spirit, and from the beginning pushed hard to get him to walk again, to keep up his interest in politics. She cut things out of the newspaper. She kept the friends coming. And she told him, she got Louis Howe organized. She got his secretary, Missy LeHand, organized with correspondence. And the deal was Franklin had to find his life again. Later, and it caused havoc. His mother and his physiotherapist and his nurse all of whom were in love with Franklin, because everybody was. They all thought Eleanor was pushing him far too hard. In later years, his two doctors would say that Franklin's mental rehabilitation, not to mention his physical rehabilitation, owed a great deal to Eleanor. So what happened now, you see, that life had changed. Franklin needed an attendant full-time. And increasingly, when the nurse had to leave for reasons that are fairly obvious, causing too much tension in the household, Missy Lahand, his secretary, started to fill the gap. And she would go down with Franklin to the south on a boat, the Loroco, he bought a houseboat, to Warm Springs, Georgia, where these warm springs he felt were really doing his muscles good. He went down for months at a time. He spent between 1924 and 1928 much more time in the south than at home, with Missy. Missy was, smiling and patient and devoted and adored him, much younger. And, she helped him sort of paste stamps he was an avid stamp collector. This would have driven Eleanor mad. I mean, Eleanor was back in New York, looking after the children, running the household, immersing herself increasingly in politics, keeping the Roosevelt name on the political map, and but increasingly, with Louis Howe's encouragement, and he was still living in the house, the two of them were sort of working together to make politics still a force in the Roosevelt house. And increasingly, Eleanor Roosevelt became, in the 1920s, the most important woman in the Democratic Party. You've got to remember, women had just got the vote, and she was brilliant, committed, charismatic, a brilliant political figure. Mama intensely disliked the new friends Eleanor was making, these women who were educated, who were sort of 1920s, bobbed hair, cigarette holder, knickerbockers. Behind Eleanor's back, cousin Alice called them female impersonators. Franklin's half-brother Rosie referred to them as Eleanor's parlor pinks. And even Franklin and Louis Howe jokingly called them she-males. But they were very fond of them, actually, and they realized the importance of the women in the Democratic Party. So what's interesting now, and you'll read in the book, is the way, for example, one day on a picnic, Eleanor was sort of complaining about, how nice it was to be free among themselves and how it was never like this in any of their homes because Mama was always in the background. And it was Franklin who said, why don't you build a cottage, which became Valkill, which you can visit today. And if you haven't, you've got to, because it's absolutely fascinating at the museum in Hyde Park. Franklin says, we'll build a house. And he designed it, by the way. And this was a house where Eleanor lived with a lesbian couple. It was a beautiful stone cottage. Mama was not at all happy about Valkill. With this house of her own, Eleanor had issued an unambiguous declaration of independence, but Franklin called it the love nest and honeymoon cottage. He was taking a subversive delight in Eleanor's new life. And then in those years, too, at Warm Springs, it didn't take Franklin long to do something else that was incredibly bold. It was dreadful being a cripple at that time. You went to some grim rehabilitation institution, and Franklin quickly had the idea that at Warm Springs, Georgia, he would set up a community where polios, as he called them, could go and find their own life again. And Warm Springs became famous as a friendly, warm, experimental community when, in between doing exercises with specialist doctors and physiotherapists, these polios could comfort each other, talk among themselves, have fun. And, Franklin had the most beautiful dining room for them and good food and picnics. And Warm Springs was a community, radical, bold, inventive. Valkill, in its little way, Eleanor and her lesbian friend, very social life that they led, and it was only 2 miles from the house at Hyde Park, which was owned by Mama, and Eleanor spent some time there, some time at Valkill. But both of these, when you think about it, were pretty daring things for them to do. On March the 17th, 1925, 4 years after polio changed their lives, Franklin and Eleanor celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. That's halfway through their marriage. They were married for 40 years on a boat, the Loroco, with the gang, as they like to call them. Louis Howe, Nancy and Marion, the lesbian friends, and so on. Although those on board might not have thought so at the time, there was good reason for celebration. After 20 years of married life, the Roosevelts had achieved something rare. Their marriage was as strong as ever, and yet they'd broken free from its traditional confines. By now it was clear to all their friends that Franklin and Eleanor were no longer a traditional couple. They also had independent lives which involved other close companions. It was a daring direction to go in, particularly for Franklin, who still harbored political ambitions and who, as a paraplegic, was already facing an uphill battle with his image. But polio had convinced him more than ever of the virtues and joys of communal life. He needed people around him, and since he couldn't get around, he needed the world to come to him. While he had no choice in the matter of his dependence, he was careful not to depend too much on any one person. And he also made sure that there was reciprocity. One of the things that gave Franklin most satisfaction was to provide the opportunity for people to do what they did best. He could see that Eleanor was happiest in New York, working in the political domain with her friends. Louis Howe was brilliant at masterminding things behind the scenes. Missy enjoyed being with Franklin as his daily companion. Everyone in the group relied on everybody else and opened up new possibilities for each other. Franklin liked this kind of bold social arrangement. And Eleanor, too, as I show, grew immensely bolder since Franklin's polio. I mean, it kind of equalized the marriage. She became a very necessary partner. Courage is more exhilarating than fear, she told friends, and in the long run, it's easier. And I won't go into it now, but it's in the book. I mean, it was difficult. Franklin hadn't recovered any of his mobility, and there were days on the houseboat, Missy would tell friends, when it took him until midday to sort of put on his cheerful facade and see friends. He was dealing with the unimaginable. I also talk about how he came back. He understood that to run for politics, he had to be seen to be back on his legs, back on his feet, and how he did this, going from crutches to the fake walk, which I won't go into now, but he practiced this in Warm Springs, with the cane and his son's arm. His son's arm was so bruised from being held like that and the cane, his physiotherapist hated him walking like that. She said, if you fall, you'll go like a tree. Bang. But he knew that he had to be seen to be able to stand and to walk. It was a deception. He couldn't stand. He was wearing 10-pound braces. He had to hold himself up on the podium. That's why he gestured with his head. But from New York, Eleanor wrote to Franklin, I'm telling everyone you're going to the Houston Convention without crutches, so mind you stick at it. I mean, he was sticking at the fake walk. And he and his son Franklin even practiced a sort of repartee thing so that they could distract observers. They had their whole joke routine going, laughing to each other as if it was easy, when in fact the bruises on their sons' arms, various sons, were apparently terrible. So, and as you know, their determination as well as their deliberate deceit resulted in a spectacular triumph. In November 1928, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected governor of New York. That's a very interesting story because he had 2 terms, 4 years, and Eleanor, who had become wary of being subsumed by her role as wife. It's difficult to be a political wife. You never know whether your husband's going to get back in again in 2 years, and if he doesn't, where are you in all this? She spent half the week as hostess of the governor's mansion in Albany, and half the week down here she took the train down to Manhattan. And she taught, but mostly she was busy in the Democratic Women's Division, more behind the scenes than before. She took her name off various things, but Louis Howe told her how she could be just as important behind the scenes. There is no doubt that Franklin owed in his election in part to the fact that Eleanor, with her tremendous grassroots organization across the country, got the women's vote galvanized. During those years, Missy LeHan moved into the executive mansion. When Eleanor was down in New York, Missy became hostess. The tongues were wagging. Meanwhile, Eleanor refused to go in a chauffeured limousine, and Franklin said, you can't drive yourself. If you insist on driving yourself everywhere, you've got to have a bodyguard. So he gave her this rather dashing state trooper, and tongues started to wag about that because Eleanor and Earl Miller they certainly had a romantic attachment. I'm sure that's all they had, by the way. But, and he burnt the letters. They wrote thousands of letters to each other because anybody who Eleanor was ever close to always remained friends until her death. She was an incredibly loyal friend. And Earl Miller and she traveled all around the state together, being Franklin's eyes and legs. And Earl Miller, by the way, was the one who was responsible for telling her, because she was so awkward in front of the cameras. And he said, you know, you have a beautiful smile. She had a jaw problem, as you know, but she does have, you'll see in the photos in the book, a beautiful smile. And even when she dressed up in her lovely evening dresses, she was a beautiful woman. So I'm telling you that they both generously accepted Missy, Earl Miller. They became part of the gang. Similarly, Ellen's lesbian friends and so on, they all became part of the gang. And I talk a great deal about their community. Franklin, during his governorship, made himself shown to be an entrenched liberal. And by this time it was the Great Depression. He was using the radio as a medium to get out to the people, which was just as well because the Hearst press, the conservative press, was 80% of the American press. So being speaking on radio at least allowed him to get his own views across directly. It's amazing to hear what Eleanor does while he's governor. And there was an article in the New Yorker which wrote of Eleanor, no woman has a better grasp of the intricacies of state business. You know, she presided over receptions, she wrote magazine articles, she gave talks, she maintained a vast correspondence. She was governor's wife, and behind the scenes she was doing her other things. Now, one other myth, so you'll find in my book I'm much more interested in talking about a very generous community than talking about extramarital affairs, which, I don't know, seems to immensely preoccupy the American mind. But also, I don't know why there is this demeaning way of talking about Franklin and Eleanor as if they had all these affairs. They had very strong romantic attachments, which they allowed each other to have, and became friendly with each other's romantic attachments. And they liked, it's not for nothing that Franklin Roosevelt in his speeches used words a lot like neighbors, community, friends. They wanted everybody, all their friends, to build houses up near them at Hyde Park. They were communal people. And in fact, I want to probably end on just a short passage which shows them in the White House. And of course, White House during the Great Depression and also the World War. I can tell you that even in Australia, Franklin and Eleanor, even in South America, certainly in France, Franklin and Eleanor were looked upon as, the very best of the American character, democracy, warm, hospitable. Their private life was intensely democratic. They were aristocrats. And yet their closest friends, people like Louis Howe, Missy LeHand, Earl Miller, came from modest backgrounds. And they never minded, not only did they not mind that, but I think they thoroughly enjoyed opening up these people's worlds. And I just wanted to read you a very quick book about life in the White House under the Roosevelts. With the Roosevelts in residence, the White House was full of laughter and vitality. You know how it was when Uncle Ted was there, how gay and homelike FDR had told his relatives at the inauguration dinner. That's all the Republican relatives. Well, that's how we mean to have it. Franklin and Eleanor enjoyed communal living. Neither of them liked to be alone, and they rarely were. They felt happiest when surrounded by talk, laughter, work, activity. They liked to have friends sleeping across the hallway who wandered into their bedrooms in pajamas to discuss urgent matters. Life in the White House suited the Roosevelts to a T. Every morning at 9 a.m., after FDR had finished his breakfast, Missy and Louis Howe would find him sitting up in his narrow bed, wearing an old sweater, surrounded by newspapers, inserting another cigarette into his cigarette holder. His other two secretaries, Steve Early and Marvin McIntyre, would turn up for their daily bedside briefing. FDR was perfectly capable of talking to passing visitors while he was in the bathroom shaving. "Take a seat on the can," he would tell them cheerily. He would happily continue their discussion while his valet, McDuffie, helped him dress. FDR was not inhibited. Missy LeHand lived in a sunny little suite on the 3rd floor, the walls of which were covered with photographs of FDR, Eleanor, and the Roosevelt children. Missy LeHand loved Eleanor, by the way, too, has said that in letters. Louis Howe lived on the 2nd floor in the Lincoln Room, across the West Hall from Eleanor. Nice skip. They often had dinner guests, and more formal dinners were carefully stage-managed. Eleanor came late to cocktails, then distracted the guests, chatting about the portraits on the walls, until Franklin had been wheeled into the dining room and transferred from his wheelchair to his seat at the end of the table. As the group walked in, he would welcome them with his big grin. "It's strange to say now," one visitor commented after Franklin's death, "but you didn't really notice he couldn't walk. He was a sort of Mount Rushmore being wheeled around, and all you noticed after a while was the Mount Rushmore part." Okay, well, I think we can have questions now. I just want to end on the note that they pushed each other hard. They expected a huge amount from each other. FDR expected an extraordinary amount from Eleanor. She worked hard. Eleanor was tough on Franklin. So that when they wanted to relax, Franklin liked to have drinks. Eleanor came from a family of alcoholics. She did not like drink. She was not a good relaxer, it has to be said. So they chose to be with others when they wanted to relax. Does that make it a bad marriage? And how many of us can talk about marriage being good or bad? You know, how many of us have experienced polio halfway through? How many of us have lived 12 years in the White House? So for us patronizingly to call it a bad marriage and a facade and so on amazes me. Far more than the woman behind the scenes, Eleanor was the woman on the scenes. She was the woman the press liked to joke was ubiquitous. Eleanor Roosevelt certainly couldn't have been the woman she was without Franklin, but I would also say, most certainly, Franklin Roosevelt would never have been FDR without Eleanor. Together they made possible what to most people would have seemed impossible. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "You must do the things you think you cannot do." She did. FDR did. As a couple, they both did. Thank you. Eleanor herself said, for example, in her autobiography, she wrote 3 volumes of autobiography, 2 volumes of which she wrote in the White House in the 1930s. And she, and I mean this is hardly surprising, any independent First Lady, has to deny ever having any political influence over her husband. She pretended in her autobiography that she never tried to influence him, all the letters show it. She was always writing to Harold Ickes, Harry Hopkins, do this, what is this true about the Negro community? Fix it up, is this true? But she denied it, and for some reason, even in today's New Yorker, it starts a new section saying, Eleanor Roosevelt never wanted to enter the White House. She, the reluctant First Lady thing is strong. It's a strong myth. I don't know why people are incapable of reading between the lines in an autobiography written by a political person who is capable of pretending that a paraplegic can walk. So, one thing is the political myth. And another thing is, I think, maybe it is a little bit American Puritanism, that the minute there's a sort of sense, even if he did have one affair, this extremely handsome man in a 40-year marriage, to me.
Are you married?
Well, no, that's not really a fair call. We'll discuss that afterwards. Are you proposing? No, but listen.
Only after I hear the answer to that question. So I know what I can get away with.
Fair enough. But, he was extraordinarily handsome. He was political. He was charismatic. So, it wouldn't be so surprising if he had one affair. But much is made of their, the lesbian, there's no doubt that, and it's fascinating in my book, that Eleanor was, by the way, the romantic affair with, and it certainly was physical to some extent anyway, with a lesbian journalist, the foremost political journalist in the country, Lorena Hickok, was exactly when Eleanor was entering the White House. She had a great effect on Eleanor and her understanding of the Depression. Eleanor read bits out of these letters to FDR. They were having dinner with Lorena Hickok and Harry Hopkins, who were traveling around the country seeing things. We could concentrate on the fact that there were romantic attachments, or we could concentrate on the fact that they had attachments with people who allowed them to do what they did, and there is no doubt that what Franklin and Eleanor achieved as a couple, as a political couple, was astounding and has never been repeated since. So that's really my thesis. Well, I think the 1920s were in many ways a more progressive time than, many decades since. Because, the people I have been working on in other books were also leading rather unconventional lives. People do, really. I don't... But yes, that's the criticism, exactly. People seem to think that people can be bold and conventional in their politics, but not in their private lives. And I was showing that they were in both, but in the most generous possible way. I mean, what a beautiful idea Warm Springs was. And how beautiful it was when the group was, and I don't idealize them, I show their flaws. There wasn't really a division between private life and political life. And they were very hardworking. They didn't know how they needed to relax, or at least Franklin did. He was dealing with immense burdens, the Depression, war, polio. And as I show, they had major tragedies in their lives. Louis Howe died, Missy Lahan died of a stroke in her 40s. A lot of unhappiness. Well, the affair in I won't call it an affair, because we don't know whether it was an affair. There was a betrayal in 1918, Franklin with Lucy Mercer. That was hard. That's no doubt hard on Eleanor. By the way, she was there when Franklin died. Much has been made of that. Probably made too much, because so were a handful of other adoring women. But open marriage, no. I'm saying that after polio, it had to open up. He had to have a valet. At first, he had to have a nurse, but he had to have a secretary and an attendant. And he wanted to be dependent in the most dignified possible way. And this is where a community comes in. You can make life hell for one woman, your wife, or you can make a community of people and give a lot to that community at the same time as taking a lot. And so open marriage, he and Eleanor definitely did choose, it was a choice, for the marriage to evolve into a community. In a sense, you could say it had always been a community. There were, 5 kids and there was the darn mother-in-law. But it became a much more positive community of people who were all working towards progressive politics. Well, I think we stop there. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you again so much to everybody for coming. We do have copies of the book for sale at the registers in the next room, and we'll have the signing right here at this table. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you very much.